It is good to be with all of you. And I want to talk about small churches, particularly the value of small churches, and especially the value of small churches right now in what we've been experiencing through COVID and then coming out of COVID. What I've noticed is, and I'm sure you've noticed this as well, right now, people are spending a lot of their time in two extreme places. On the one extreme, they're isolated, stuck in their homes, isolated. On the other hand, they're spending time engaged in mass and social media. So it's aloneness and it's massive crap in a mass and social media. And on those two extremes, if all we're doing is toggling back and forth between those two extremes, that's a really unhealthy place for people to live, including us as pastors. And in fact, here's the deal. We toggle between the two of those at the same time. While home alone by ourselves, we engage with people on mass and social media. And both of those have a tendency to make people feel anonymous. Looking at this camera, looking at the screen acts like a window, or it looks like a window, but it actually acts like a wall. It actually causes a great deal of separation, and it doesn't help us to see people as they actually are. How much easier is it, for instance, to get online and criticize somebody through your fingers on a keyboard than it is if they were actually sitting in the room, and how you would differently engage with them in conversation? So given that that's where people are spending a lot of their time recently, the challenge is, what's the answer to that? And the answer to that is the middle ground of community, not isolated and alone, not engaged with people only on mass media and social media, but actually engaging with people. Now, right now, physically, we may not be able to do that as much as we'd like. But you know what I've discovered is my smartphone is still a phone. Especially as a pastor, and especially as a pastor of a smaller congregation, I've rediscovered the phone part of my smartphone. So what I'm doing more than I had before was I'm actually getting on the phone and I'm actually calling people and saying, "Hi, how are you? How are things going?" And especially for me as a smaller church pastor, the people I'm calling, I actually know them. I've spent time with them. They spent time with me. So when I call them and they say, "Oh, I'm doing fine," I can tell the little hitch in their voice that says they're not fine. And I can pause and go, "You say you're fine, but that's not what I'm hearing." And that's how we can reach out to health in this. With all of this, I actually proposed this idea to a friend of mine, and she has a doctorate in neurobiology, and she's also a pastor's wife. So she's got her feet in two very interesting worlds. So on the one side, neurobiology, which is the physical mapping of the brain. So she has a doctorate in the physical construction of our brains, and she's a pastor's wife. And so I asked her, what's happening now and what's actually going on in our brains over the last 9 to 10 months or so? And she said, well, first of all, we're all experiencing trauma. And I threw out my little theory about isolated and mass media. And she said, you're right. Those are dangerous places to toggle between. And right now what's happening is everybody is in trauma. And I said, what actually happens in our brains during trauma? And she said, what happens in our brain during trauma is very, very, it's not subtle, it's very evident. In trauma, a couple of things happen. First of all, when a person is in trauma, they are literally neurobiologically incapable of retaining new information. They can't hear explanations when you're in trauma. And she says, everybody you meet right now is at some level of trauma they've never experienced before. So what she says is they hook people up, with the things in their brains. And then what they do is they ask people to talk through the trauma they had experienced. And as they get to the more traumatic parts of their stories and they kind of re-experience it and reliving it as they're saying it, what she says happens every single time. They can watch it really obviously on their monitors. The logic parts of our brain shut down. And you know what lights up? The action and emotion parts of our brain light up. This is what the military has known for for generations now. That's what, when they're training soldiers, what they want to do is they recognize that the soldier, the first time they get into battle, especially, the trauma of battle is going to shut down their logic. They're not going to be able to think clearly what to do next, which is why they train them so hard, so that when they get into the trauma of battle and their logic center shut down, their muscle memory kicks in and their action and emotion does the thing that they're trained to do. So I said, given all of that, that's your experience as a neurobiologist. Now, as your experience as a pastor's wife, what do we do about that? If everybody we're talking to is experiencing some level of trauma, including ourselves, if they can't hear explanations about what's going on, but they're going to act emotional out of emotion and out of action, because that's what lights up is emotion and action parts of our brain. What do we do? And she said, here's what people need. People need familiar situations and familiar actions with familiar people. Familiar situations and familiar actions with familiar people. So she said, as a pastor's wife, for instance, we're already talking about it. When we're able to physically gather as a church again, we are going to shorten the sermons for a while, and we're going to lengthen our worship time. We're going to sing longer and talk less. We're going to purposely give people opportunities to catch up, to pray with each other, to spend time together. In the meantime, until we can't, she was the one who enforced for me, pick up your phone and actually use the phone part of your smartphone, because a familiar voice on the other end of the phone is much more comforting and much more healing to us in trauma than still trying to negotiate what is still this new experience of staring. Right now, I'm looking at a video camera and acting like it's a person, and it's not, and it never will be. And there will always be a distance there, right? We call it Zoom fatigue now, right? I'm grateful that we can do this, but let's all acknowledge this is not ideal. Right? If we could be in the same room, we would prefer to be in the same room. There would be benefits out of being in the same room that we simply cannot duplicate by video conference. Now, gratefully, we can do some of these things, and I'm profoundly grateful that we can do the parts of it that we can do. But let's not pretend like this is ideal or this is the best choice. It's not. So what do we do? As pastors, and especially for me coming from a small church perspective, what I hear in all of that from my friend is that small churches are now uniquely placed to help people heal, to help people get restored again, including people who before this year might not have been open to hear about the gospel, but are simply wanting a place of community and of hope again. So what do we offer them? Longer sermons? No. We can still do good sermons. They probably ought to be a little shorter. We need to offer them familiar people in familiar settings doing familiar things. And as the church, that means when God's people gather together, even if we're distanced and even if we're masked, which we are here in California, and I'm not sure, what the situation is where you are, still people are longing for this. Last night at our church, for the first time in almost a year now, we had women's Bible study and we had men's Bible study, and we had bigger crowds show up for both than we've ever had in the history of our church. We had to sit at a distance. Everybody in the room had to wear a mask. We had to have the doors open so the breeze could blow through. We had everybody wash their hands before they came in. We did all that protocol. And even knowing that all of those restrictions would be in place, more showed up than it ever showed up before, because they miss being in the room with each other. And though we called it a Bible study and we did study the Bible, we spent more time doing it conversationally than simply me teaching to them. The teaching part was shorter, and the sharing back and forth about what the story of Ruth means to us was really what we spent most of our time with. So that's what they need. They need the familiarity. They need the stability, because in trauma, they can't hear explanations. They can't process new information. So even when we do preach, one of the reasons we decided to do the book of Ruth was because 5-6 years ago, we did the book of Ruth in our church, and it was one of those things that everybody just really loved. And we thought, you know what, let's just retell that beautiful story of the kinsman redeemer. Let's tell that story again. The new folks in the church, some of them will be hearing it for the first time, but for most of us, it's a familiar story that we know where it goes. We know how it leads to King David and eventually through the genealogy to Jesus. We see the parallel of Boaz and Ruth. And so we gave them a familiar story that gave them a chance to really explore that and to talk about it together, rather than trying to give them some deep theological explanation that they hadn't had before. So familiarity, stability. One of the challenges for us as pastors with that is this. For the past 40 years, probably in ministry, most of the teaching that I've been given for how to pastor churches is how to unstick a stuck church, how to motivate an unmotivated church, how to bring change to an unchangeable church, how to bring discomfort to an overly comfortable church. Right? How many books, how many ministries, how many podcasts are about unsticking the stuck church? That still applies, and that always will apply. But right now is not the time for us to cause disruption. There's enough disruption already. People have their lives disrupted more in the last year than most of us have had, certainly collectively more than we've had at any other time in my lifetime. The last thing people need is more disruption. What they need is they need stability. So here's what good, godly leaders do. In times of stability, leaders bring disruption. In times of disruption, leaders bring stability. And right now is a time of disruption, and we need to bring stability. Now, that doesn't mean we don't capitalize on some of the changes that are happening. For instance, if you have had to stop doing certain programs during this season, and before you gather back together, you look around and decide, how are we going to reenact those programs again? Before you reenact any of the programs that you've had to stop, ask yourself this question: if we hadn't been doing that program before, would we restart it now? And if the answer is no, then maybe you just don't restart it. One of the things that most churches, and especially most small churches, which is where I minister mostly, one of the biggest challenges for most small churches is that we are over-programmed. And reducing the program load on our congregations is difficult, but this is the easiest time that it will ever be. Not starting a program back up again will be far easier than if you start it back up and then in a couple of years look at it and go, maybe we shouldn't have started it back up again. So yes, there are things where we can capitalize on the changes that are happening, even capitalize on the disruption that's occurring. But now is the time primarily to bring stability into people's lives and not cause disruption.